Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you this week actually in Munich. And as always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
Okay, so 2 segments for you all today. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about Greenland, the economics of Greenland, which has been in the news, obviously with Trump expressing his ambitions to win Greenland over for the United States. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, we wanted to talk about something else in the news. The data point there is $275 billion. That's the estimated costs of the ongoing fires in Los Angeles, the forest fires that have taken out several neighborhoods in Los Angeles.
Scenes of apocalyptic destruction as 6 different wildfires turn some of the most iconic neighborhoods in the world into moonscapes.
Forecasters say that more high winds are expected, which could stoke an already perilous situation. President Biden has said the city reminds him of a war scene.
Los Angeles have killed at least 25 people and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses. The biggest worry now remains the threat of more strong winds that could spark new blazes.
The weather data company AccuWeather assessed the costs of those fires at that $275 billion figure. That's including not just all of the homes that were destroyed, but also the knock-on effects of the jobs that were lost, the health consequences of all the smoke and toxic ash that's been produced by these fires. It's been an unprecedented catastrophe in Los Angeles. It also struck us that we haven't really talked about Los Angeles on this show, so we thought we'd try to devote one segment to understanding America's second largest city. But first off, Adam, to sort of zero in on these fires, these forest fires are happening in areas that have always been subject to this kind of disaster. And I'm curious what accounts for the property development in these areas of Los Angeles that have always been subject to these risks. I mean, were the risks unknown at the time that the properties were developed, or were they just ignored, or have the risks, changed substantially over time?
I mean, you don't want to, at a moment like this, come across as sort of self-righteously declaring, well, we told you so, or, kind of gloating over the confirmation of predictions of increased risk from climate change and so on. But the fact of the matter is that indeed, this entire region has been well understood for decades as an area of extremely high risk. There's this famous book from the left by Mike Davis called The Ecology of Fear, which features this notorious chapter, the case for letting Malibu burn, and that was published in 1998. And though the book was highly controversial amongst geographers, environmentalists, the case that Davis was making, namely that the unfettered private business, private capital-driven development of LA was a recipe for catastrophe, very much of the type that's played out, was in fact, I think, a commonplace. And so maybe just to kind of take the blame game finger-pointing out of this, we should say that, from a kind of rational choice economic perspective, clearly California's very substantial property development in recent years in these areas has gone ahead in the face of what was basically, for anyone who wanted to know, perfectly well-established knowledge about risk. And what we're seeing is simply the playing out of a worst-case scenario, in a spectrum of risks that were really quite well mapped ahead of time. It's the scale of this build-out is really dramatic. 10 years ago, it was estimated that 1 million new homes would be built over the coming decades in very high-risk wildfire zones. At the time, that's 10 years ago, it was thought that there were 2 million homes in high and very high-risk areas in the state of California. Los Angeles County was notorious for having the most homes in the areas of high-risk wildfires. And nevertheless, development goes on, and it goes on because the development and the property lobbies, and it does its thing. And so efforts by Californian legislators to prescribe, to limit this expansion, fail. And they fail because of counter lobbying by business, which doesn't want to see the highly profitable business of property development in California brought to a halt. It's a business which generates $50 to $60 billion a year in revenue, considerable profit. It's motivated in part by the insistent drumbeat of people saying, well, California needs new homes, look at the housing crisis, but that's not actually a very good explanation for the type of building that gets done in these high-risk areas, which is very high-value property construction. In a sense, this is a case of, you could say, market failure, perhaps, in the sense that clearly very substantial risks are not being adequately priced in. There was a wave of insurance withdrawals, with conventional American property insurance companies increasingly refusing to insure Californian homes in the most high-risk areas, which it's the suddenness of that adjustment that tells you that something's gone wrong here. If the risks had been properly priced, then there would not be a shock, and the property values and the insurance risk would always have been as high as it needs to be, which is maybe 5x, 10x what conventional home insurance in the United States costs. You need to be spending tens of thousands of dollars per year to insure a high-value home in a place of high risk like this, and people are obviously not, their mind is not set on those kind of numbers. That's property tax, that's not insurance. But in future, clearly those are the kind of premiums that are going to be demanded. And so that's, I think, the kind of scenario that's played out here, a rather short-sighted push by property developers, buyers who are, with half their mind willing to take the risk and the other half somehow kidding themselves that this worst-case scenario will never actually transpire, in the face of overwhelming evidence that it was, in fact, increasingly risky. And so it's a pretty clear instance of that kind of maladjustment. The really sad thing is the collateral damage. So the risk, obviously, to communities, the risk to the firefighters, the loss of life that's entailed, but also at the more micro level, the fact that building properties into the high-risk zone exposes property in lower-risk zones to higher risks. And so there is, on the face of it, not just an argument for letting wealthy Californians with expensive homes fend for themselves, which will be the standard market logic solution here. Well, if people want to take the risk, to let them insure themselves and let the risks be reflected in the property values. There is also, I think, a case for a renewed push for regulation because, fires spread. And they are one of the classic instances of externalities. You don't, when your neighbour's house is burning down, argue about property rights. You mobilise to put your neighbour's fire out, in part because there is a substantial risk of it spreading to you. And that's clearly what's happened in the case of the Palisade fires, is that areas which would not normally have expected to burn have found themselves exposed to risks as a result of the overexpansion of housing in the area. So I think that's, a kind of a deliberately de-escalated description of the situation. I think we're beyond the point where we can any longer reasonably argue about the climate case, the fact that these ecological risks are just increasing all the time in California. There's no point in engaging in a kind of over-emotional, moralistic conversation about, I told you so on the one hand, or, accusations of bad faith on the other. These are risks, and frankly, everyone who was serious about the situation has known it for decades. And this is the worst case. And obviously thinking out from a situation of the worst case is difficult, and it's an appalling disaster for those who are caught up in it.
Yeah, it does seem like the insurance industry has a central role to play here in, whether this is a viable market or not.
Setting the right price in future, yeah, because clearly there are going to be syndicates in Lloyd's in London who are perfectly willing to take on these risks, but they will charge a price. And it's not going to be your average American home insurance of, $4,000 or $5,000 a year or something like that for a big house. It's going to be much more substantial kind of levels of premium that need to be paid.
Obviously Los Angeles is indelibly associated with Hollywood. Hollywood, this may be the reason that we, in part, have been as fascinated, or the world has been as fascinated by this catastrophe. It's the center of this global cultural industry. Hollywood is both a neighborhood, but also a kind of symbol of that entertainment film and television industry. I'm curious if we could kind of just unpack its genealogy a bit. I mean, like, why did the film industry move to Los Angeles in the first place? I mean, is this just an arbitrary historical accident, or are there structural, geographic reasons that favored LA for this industry?
Well, I think the sort of standard answer is that, the weather's pleasant, labor was easy to find, there was plenty of space, land was cheap once upon a time outside LA, and so it was a good place to go. But you found this very interesting article about patent rights and struggles over intellectual property in the US, which turns on the figure of Edison, who in 1891 patented the kinetoscope, I guess it was probably called, which was like a movie projector. And Edison then went on to build in his typically aggressive way. I mean, Edison was above all, if you like, an IP manager and an entrepreneur whose entire effort was focused on building IP and then defending it and extracting maximum profit. So he established something called the Motion Picture Patents Company, which was essentially a trust, the Edison Trust, which then in a very aggressive fashion for the next 25 years went after any business that was interested in making movies. So Universal Studios had apparently 289 legal complaints by the Edison Trust in the first 20 odd years of its existence. And essentially what that did was it centered the movie business on the East Coast in New Jersey of all places, and it had it dominated by this Edison Trust. And so there was in fact an impulse, even before the Supreme Court ruled in 1915 and struck down the Edison Trust, there was an impulse to, as it were, establish movie making beyond the reach of this New Jersey East Coast trust. And California was attractive also for that reason. So the Palisades, which has been the center of the fire drama, was established as a residential neighborhood. Actually, in the wreckage, in the amidst the sort of the brownfield site, it was had previously been developed by one of the very first Hollywood studios. It was known as Intsville originally, after the name of the founder. It was a kind of classic pioneering studio lot as we imagine them from black and white movies, with sort of fake Japanese villages, Italian towns, and so on. This was all by the early 1920s in ruins as Hollywood's dynamic had moved on, and it was then into that space that a group of Protestant fundamentalist property developers sort of implanted themselves in the Palisades, which then by the 1930s had become an extremely desirable residential neighborhood, attracting, some of the great stars of the Weimar Republic, Thomas Mann, Theodor Adorno. They all lived in this area. But it was an effect of this drift of the movie scene from its origins on the East Coast beyond the reach of the Edison cartel to far off California.
Yeah, I'd love to dig in even more into Los Angeles's identity and how that's affected by its geography. Obviously, you're in New York and I'm in Europe, but I'm curious, whether Los Angeles is essentially more of a Pacific city, oriented towards the Pacific Rim because of its geography, rather than a transatlantic city, or rather a Latin American city, oriented towards South America, again, rather than Europe. How should we, make sense of Los Angeles's geography and its resulting identity?
I think it's ended up that way, but man, did it struggle to avoid that. I mean, if you go back to its origins, of course, in the period of Spanish settlement, then the entire Spanish imperial complex is highly Asian-centered, right? Because one of the great payoffs, other than the looting of silver and gold of the Spanish Empire in Central and South America, was that it gave them the launching pad for extensive trade with their own empire in Asia and with China beyond. And so the Manila Galleon trade, which was a trade between the Philippines and Mexico, created early on in the 16th and 17th hundreds a truly Pacific-orientated new world with huge consequences, right, for both sides. Like, if you think about just at the culinary level, the chilies, which are such a fundamental staple of Asian food, come from South America by way of the Spanish Empire. The Anglo settlers that make it to the American West in the course of the 1800s are I think, the best way to characterize them is, though, of course, they're fascinated by the Pacific, they are profoundly committed to avoiding precisely that kind of entanglement. I mean, either with, of course, the native population against which they perpetrated genocide, or against the original Spanish settlers, or against the possibility of a deep entanglement and settlement by either Japanese or Chinese, who do arrive to feed the manpower needs of the gold rush and they're attracted by the gold rush, but are vigorously resisted by the white population that arrives there. I mean, it's very strange when you read the histories of LA. I mean, it's described in its early phases as white bread, right? As profoundly segregationist, fundamentally dominated by a Protestant white settler group that certainly thought about the Pacific. If you think about, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and the building of the Pacific Fleet, but that's actually more San Diego, more San Francisco than it is LA. LA is more continental, inward orientated, agriculturally dominated. It's the story of Chinatown, right? It's about the development of the giant agrarian resources of the region. It's a question of water. LA, I think, enters the global story really with World War II, because LA becomes one of the great hubs of the American aerospace complex, not just Hollywood, but the other dimension of American power, which is hard power. And then from the 1960s onwards, as late as that, as recently as that, it becomes the great, people don't call it, they say it's not a melting pot, it's a salad bowl, right? This extraordinarily multicultural city, majority, minority, with vast influxes of Mexican, Central American migrants, and then also migrants from Asia. But it's a relatively recent story, really a story from the mid-60s onwards, which, yes, then by the time talk of the Pacific Rim became current in the second phase of the Cold War in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, meant that California and LA in particular were sort of legitimately seen as the capital of that development process. But that isn't LA's early history, which is more, I think, a story of this rather, well, it's essentially like really a segregationist white Protestant vision of an American West.
Yeah, in some ways that brings me then to my last question, which is, it concerns the institutions in LA today, the public institutions. I'm thinking, first of all, of the LAPD. That's an LA institution that somehow has become culturally symbolic of the city, its inequalities, its racial tensions. I'm curious, what sort of symbol do you think the LA Fire Department now represents? I mean, is the fire department a genuinely common public resource for a city that we've just described as essentially being perpetually in danger of natural disaster?
Yeah, I think LAPD acquired that reputation largely through collaboration with TV and Hollywood, right? So, Hollywood's representations of American state power, whether they're in the form of the military or police, are deliberately engineered by both sides. And LAPD famously worked a kind of media connection with Hollywood that established that connection. So LAPD certainly has that prominence that the fire department does not. It's also much bigger. It has 12,000 staff and a multi-billion-dollar budget compared to the LA Fire Department, which has 3,900 staff and a budget less than $1 billion, which in fact quite recently was subject to cuts as part of an overall budget balancing exercise. But the LA Fire Department, as far as I'm able to establish, and hell, I'm no deep LA aficionado, rather the contrary. But if you read into this, what you find is that the LA Fire Department was in fact even more notorious than the LAPD for its racism. And if you look at the composition of the firefighters in terms of their racial profile as using standard American categories, then the fire department appears to be a more clearly segregated institution than even the police department. I mean, perhaps unsurprising given that the police department actually has to interact at street level, whereas the fire department are the heroes that arrive, with their sirens blaring to rescue people from apartment buildings. It was until the 1980s a 72% white force. which in a city like LA is really quite remarkable. It has had to fight a series of cases around various types of discrimination. And part of the politics of the current crisis is addressed precisely to what many people, I think, would regard as the belated efforts by the LA Fire Department to, in fact, diversify the crews, diversify the men and women that protect LA from fires. And that then opens the door to the kind of criticism that we've been seeing, which is that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion measures have been at the expense of, actual firefighting capacity. But that, I think, is a reflection of decades of struggle in which the LA Fire Department was in many ways an anachronistic hangover from that mid-century moment in which LA was really a white-dominated city. The black population of LA, if we're thinking about the racial politics of US more generally, only really emerges on a large scale during World War II. So, in the early stages, it's really absolutely a kind of white-dominated enclave, followed by a large movement of black workers to the factories of World War II, followed then in the 60s and onwards from there by Mexican, by Latino migration and a huge influx of Asian migrants. But I think all of the institutions of LA are, like it or not, caught up in this struggle over what kind of a society this city, and with it also large parts of the United States, are going to be in the decades going forward from here.
Yeah, perhaps symbolic of that there is no shortage of apparently private firefighting crews that are being hired by the wealthy in LA to address their needs.
And also that California relies as heavily as it does on incarcerated firefighters. So largely men, I think, who are taken from California's massively overcrowded prison system and earn really menial labor, but menial wages, doing this incredibly dangerous and important job.
Yeah, certainly symbolic. Okay, we will take a break here now and return in a second to talk about Greenland. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is a range, $12.5 billion to $77 billion. That's the estimated fair price for Greenland that the United States could offer. That's according to a real estate developer, David Barker, and a former economist at the New York Fed. He did that sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation based on previous sales of land that the United States has engaged in. What's clear is that Donald Trump, who is now taking office as U.S. president again, is interested in gaining control of Greenland for the United States, whether that comes in the form of a sale or some sort of deal with Denmark, which formally controls Greenland, is an open question. But yeah, we thought we'd take a general look at what Greenland's economy even consists of. And so to start, Adam, I'm curious how Denmark came to possess Greenland in the first place, and yeah, just how the history of Danish colonialism has affected life on Greenland.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic. There's quite a rabbit hole to go down. But I think the short answer to, how did Greenland end up attached to Denmark is Vikings and Norway, therefore. Because there's been human settlement on Greenland for thousands of years going back. I mean, archaeology shows back to before, 2,000 years been there before the Common Era. But settlement by Europeans seems to have begun in the late 9th century with Vikings sailing out of Norway. Folks like Eric the Red, Eric's son Leif Erikson, who we think also then pressed on to Newfoundland, were amongst the earliest European settlers of Newfoundland. It's a Norse settlement that's well established archaeologically, and that from the 900s through to the medieval period, the 1450s, the 1500s, at which point it dies out. So Greenland, the Norse settlement of Greenland is in fact an interesting example of community collapse. I mean, it's been widely cited by people like Jared Diamond and others as an instance of ecological failure. There was failure to manage conflicts with the other local population, with the Inuit. There was cultural conservatism that meant that they weren't able to adjust to a changing climate. And so actually the Norse settlement of Greenland peters out in the Middle Ages, except that no one let the Europeans know because it was such a long way away. And in the meantime, as a result of dynastic politics in the late medieval period, as the Norse settlement on Greenland was actually facing its extinction, Denmark rises to its highest extent of power by way of dynastic connections to Norway on the one hand. We're talking now late 1380s, 1400s, and Sweden as well. In 1397, Denmark becomes the center of the Kalmar Union. And as a result, possessions that were attached to Norway pass to the Danes, even as those possessions are actually losing their population. So this newly dynamized Denmark in the 1500s, 1600s, the Kalmar Union sheds Sweden, but Norway and Denmark remain attached to each other, becomes in its own right a rather ambitious colonial power. They establish Danish possessions in the Caribbean. There are Danish slave trading posts in West Africa. And someone has the idea that they ought to revive Danish-Norwegian colonial claims that go all the way back to the Vikings. And so they send missionaries to Greenland in the early 1700s, only to discover that there are, in fact, no Norse-descended people left there. And so instead what they do, faute de mieux, is to simply convert the Inuit population and begin new settlement with quite catastrophic results, because people coming from Europe in the 1700s tend to carry smallpox with them, which creates this belated, almost haphazard settlement of Greenland by this expanded Danish-Norwegian medieval, early modern state. Denmark in the 1700s reaches its kind of maximum imperial extension and then falls on hard times in the 1800s. The Napoleonic Wars lead to a fissure with the Norwegians increasingly independent. Then in the 1840s and the 1860s, the Danes lose wars against the emerging Germans. In the early 1900s, the Norwegians finally gain full independence and immediately challenge the Danish claim. This is the first claim to say, well, what entitlement have you got to this? And an international court of arbitration, in fact, asserts that this population of a couple of 10,000 people, huge distance from Denmark, should actually be attached to Denmark. This claim is then challenged again during World War II because the Danish government remains in Denmark during the war. Exiled resistance Danish ministers, it falls to them to negotiate with the United States over the future of Greenland, which has huge strategic significance in the conduct of the U-boat war, the submarine war during World War II. It's a disowned rogue Danish diplomat who does a deal with the United States to secure Greenland as part of the Allied coalition in the war against Germany, which raises questions about Greenland's future after World War II again. And once more, the Danes reassert this tenuous claim. They have a series of commissions which confirm that Greenland will remain with Denmark. But ultimately, it's a very precarious grip they hold. In the 70s, autonomous movements in Greenland become more and more powerful. We're talking about a society now of 30 to 40,000 people, so a small college town presiding over this giant territory. By the 1980s, the Greenlanders even gain the right to opt out of the EU, which Denmark is part of, over the issue of fishing, which is crucial to the Greenland economy. And from the 2000s onwards, there's a full-blown Greenland independence movement. Increasingly, Danish is resisted as an official language of Greenland. So it's a fragile connection at best, and one that has increasingly been resolving itself towards various claims for independence. Crucially, however, though, and it's important to recognize this in light of America's interest, is that the Greenlanders have representation in the Danish parliament. So they are fully enfranchised Danish citizens. Of course, they're a tiny group within a much bigger and richer society. So their interests don't count for much in the Danish parliament, but they are present, and Denmark maintains its connection, first by way of a trading monopoly, which we should say more about, but more recently through very generous levels of subsidy from Copenhagen and Denmark to Greenland.
Thanks for that tour of Greenland's history. I'm curious if we were to say for today, does Greenland have significant untapped economic potential? And if that economic potential is untapped, what exactly explains the blockage? I mean, is it a lack of political attention that the Danish government offers, or a lack of investment of capital? I mean, how would we explain Greenland's current economy?
So the answer for a long time was very clear. I mean, what defined the Greenland economy was fishing or hunting. That's seals, whales, cod, shrimp. That's the story. And for much of Greenland's history until the recent period, its trade, its economy was entirely defined by the monopoly held by the so-called KGH, the Royal Greenland Trading Company, which monopolized all imports and exports from Greenland. Greenland was a very significant base for whaling and seal hunting, and all the way down to the present day, that grim business continues in Greenland. It's one of the major killers of seals and whales. In the early 20th century, Greenland became the base for one of the most powerful cod fishing fleets in the world, operating in the huge shoals of Atlantic cod. And then as those fisheries became exhausted by the intrusion of fishing fleets from all over the world, but notably from the Soviet Union, United States, and Europe, they moved to shrimp, and that seafood accounts for the vast majority of Greenland's exports all the way down to the present day. Greenland is known to have other resources, notably ore. One of the things that gave Greenland its significance in the World War II was that it's a major source of cryolite, which is crucial in the production of aluminium. But it's also thought now that Greenland has reserves of perhaps 43 of the 50 minerals which are deemed critical by the United States in the current moment of supply chain anxiety. Greenland may have lots of those. And there are also people who believe that Greenland has got very substantial amounts of offshore oil, which is waiting to be developed. There are some very large estimates of 110 billion barrels plus that might be there, which would put Greenland amongst one of the larger medium-sized, reserve fields. There's also the possibility of uranium and other rare earth deposits. The reason why this has not been developed in the recent period is no longer the monopoly of the Royal Greenland Trading Company, but more mundane economics and politics. The investment necessary to develop very large-scale ore mining or oil production would be daunting. The interest in Greenland's oil goes up when the oil price is high and goes down when the oil price moderates and as other sources of supply come on stream. And furthermore, Greenland's own politics, which is quite turbulent and quite insistent on its autonomy. In 2021, the Greenland Parliament banned all uranium mining and casting a pale over other areas of mineral prospecting. So there is local political risk, there is market risks, there are very substantial infrastructure costs, and those are really the main obstacles to Greenland's further, economic development.
So I guess that leads to my next question, which is how exactly would the United States stand to benefit from absorbing Greenland? You just described all the kind of, daunting hurdles in the way of further investments there, but maybe there are benefits beyond just strictly narrow economic ones then for the United States?
Well, it's a huge landmass. I mean, it's 2.1 million square kilometers. That's more than the size of Alaska and California combined. With a population of 56,000, which is the size of a small college town. It's less than a quarter of the people that live on the Upper West Side of New York, where I'm speaking to you from, right? It's a huge amount of land with hardly anyone in it. If you want some empty real estate, this is a place to buy it. And of course, it's very strategically located, and not for nothing since World War II. When America first began to build bases in Greenland, America has substantially expanded its footprint. One of the ways in which the Danish government calmed down American interest after the war was by allowing them to build the Thule Air Force Base, which is 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's the most northerly of America's bases. It's of great significance during the Cold War for tracking missiles with radar. It's now a key base for the US Space Force. So I mean, that's one reason why America would be interested, a huge piece of real estate in a rather strategic location that's already of military interest. That is only going to get more interesting as climate change changes the geography of the North Pole and opens up a variety of different shipping routes, logistical avenues, but also forms of military access which haven't been available before. So you think immediately, of course, of the confrontation with the Soviet Union and now Russia. But what has also come into play is China. And China from the 2010s onwards began to express a quite intense interest in Greenland development. China plays for keeps, and it plays all over the entire map. And, you know, if you had an open-minded approach to where you might be interested in having a infrastructural or raw materials base, you could certainly come, you know, to the conclusion that Greenland would be remarkably interested. And in 2015, Greenland's Minister of Finance and the Interior actually made a trip to China to explore these options. I mean, it's the sort of story that we're only too familiar with from other parts of the world where China finds weak links in the Western chain, and Greenland would be one of those, and moves in, you know, with tempting offers of investment and commercial interest. In the first Trump administration already, the Washington was trying to fend off China's interest in Greenland and exercise pressure on Denmark, on Copenhagen, to exert pressure on Greenland to halt any further conversation with the Chinese. So I think these are the key elements, right? The first is it's already of huge geopolitical significance to the US and has been since World War II and the Cold War. It's changing and increasingly significant because of climate change. And thirdly, because with China, there is just this voracious global player in the geopolitical game that really, you know, has an incredibly broad-minded and visionary approach to global geopolitics and doesn't shrink from the idea of Chinese development of Greenland resources.
Okay, so what about from the perspective of Greenlanders themselves? I mean, how would they stand to benefit if Greenland were to become part of the United States somehow? I mean, what benefits do residents of U.S. territories receive versus, you know, the status quo that Greenlanders currently have as being a Danish territory?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very ambiguous thing from Greenland's point of view, because I think what they want is independence, notionally. At least that was, as it were, the push for Greenland politics since the early 2000s. But the problem is that they currently receive from Denmark an annual subsidy to the tune of about $500 million, which is roughly a quarter of Greenland's GDP. Half of all employed people in Greenland work in the public sector, which is sustained as part of the Danish government budget. So exactly how the math of this would work out, right? These are 56,000 Europeans living in this space, not 56,000 settler colonialists, right, waiting for the United States to exert sovereignty over them. They are, you know, fully paid up members of one of the most rich European welfare states, with Copenhagen paying a hefty price to maintain at least a marginal degree of loyalty on Greenland's part. And we don't need to speculate, after all, about what the deal would be if Greenland joined the United States, because there's already several territories, and the US Virgin Islands are ex-Danish. And the answer is that there are certain tax advantages to being part of the United States, but fundamentally what you lose is sovereignty and indeed a voice in the national political system, because residents of the US territories have basic constitutional rights, all except the fact that they don't vote in American presidential elections. So, and as a result, they're treated, you know, very much in a second tier of second-class citizens within US federal politics. And, you know, Greenland's situation is not that of Puerto Rico, but you only have to look at Puerto Rico to see how dangerous this can be for, you know, a vulnerable political economy. Greenland is richer than Puerto Rico, but it's a fragile economy. And if I was Greenlander, I would worry about the deal being done here. You would want very heavy commitments from the American side. And it doesn't fundamentally respond to what seems to be the basic demand of Greenlanders, which is some form of sovereignty, some form of independence.
Yeah, finally, I wanted to zoom out a bit and ask about the diplomacy at stake here. We're talking here about potentially the United States purchasing territory from Denmark. And, as you've mentioned yourself, this is not an unheard of diplomatic practice. The U.S. bought the Danish West Indies in the early 20th century, also Alaska from Russia in the previous century. And yet, this kind of purchasing of territory doesn't seem so common anymore. So why has this practice faded in more recent times?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating question. I mean, if you look back, according to one itemization I've seen, in the 19th century, there were 13 instances of large-scale transfer of territory in exchange for payment. So in other words, buying territory. And in the 20th century, only 6. And the United States is the main participant in all of those transactions. And all of the really large transactions of the 19th and early 20th century were done by the United States. The Louisiana Purchase, the purchases from Mexico, and then Alaska. And in the age of high imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century, the United States paid compensation to Spain for the transfer of the Philippines. And then during World War I, the Wilson administration opened negotiations with Denmark for the purchase of the Danish Caribbean colonies, which then became the US Virgin Islands. The transaction was in part motivated by strategic interests, I think, above all. It was about the US policy of trying to, quote unquote, stabilize the Caribbean, but also exclude German interests. And Denmark and the United States, both at the time being neutral in World War I, could also be seen as, if you like, geopolitically aligned at that point, with Denmark not wanting to pay the bill or take the responsibility for governing its Caribbean possessions, and the United States anxious to patrol the boundaries of the Monroe Doctrine. As recently as the 1940s, the United States was still in the business of cash for territory deals. I mean, the largest one that actually went through was the destroyers for bases deal that was done with Britain under the pressure of, Nazi attack early in World War II, with Britain trading very long-term leases in its Caribbean possessions for a collection of rather antique American destroyers that were crucial for defending the British convoys in the struggle against the U-boats. And at the end of World War II, the United States made another offer to Denmark for Greenland. So on the basis of the 1941 treaty, the United States offered Denmark $100 million in gold bullion for Greenland, which the Danes politely declined. And it's out of that embarrassing maneuver on the part of the Americans and the Danes that the treaty emerged to establish the American bases in Greenland during the Cold War. So there is a continuity here of imperial practice that goes back to the 19th century, that has been formative for the expansion of American territory and American, what else to call it, American empire. And I think the fundamental reason why it has increasingly died out in the course of the 20th century, and these kind of transactions that were occurring regularly at different scales in the 19th century have become the extreme exception. The sale of Egyptian territory to Saudi Arabia in the last 12 to 18 months may be the last instance that we've seen in many decades, is self-determination. Like, that's the fundamental reason why the idea of selling territory has become fundamentally at odds with the current moment, and why I think the American bid under Trump to buy Greenland, I mean, if it was presented as a logic of American patronage over Greenland self-determination against continuing Danish dominance, that would actually feel more contemporary than this rather cynical seeming approach, which simply says, okay, how much is it worth? Can we buy it? And I think the idea that people, the right to self-determination of people who inhabit a land and a homeland trumps all other claims is really the fundamental reason why these kind of purchases I mean, already in the rhetoric of the Versailles Peace Treaty, you can see that this was no longer acceptable as a way of conducting policy. And so the territorial transfers that take place have to be legitimated either on the principle of, ethnic geography and claims to creating homogenous nation states, or the conduct of referenda of different types. And that, I think, would be the precondition for any of this to be even remotely serious. How the Greenlanders would vote, I think, is an open question. It would depend perhaps on the offer that the United States made, because they're certainly not enthusiastic and loyal members of citizens of Denmark. But whether or not they would choose, whatever offer the Americans made, I think that's the thing that Washington hasn't really wrapped its head around, which is that if you wanted to do this, you would actually need to appeal to the Greenlanders, not to Copenhagen, figuring out the price that Denmark would accept, which of course the Danes will flatly refuse, is not actually your problem. The problem is, can you get the local population to vote for you? And in those kind of exercises, of course, there's well-practiced exercises in essentially, what is the subsidy regime that would make it attractive for Greenlanders to leave Denmark and join the United States? Would be what is the package of rights and subsidies that make that move attractive? Is the question that's open and doesn't really seem to have been posed in that form by folks in Washington.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that's not how Trump is thinking about this issue. Yeah, rather more as a kind of real estate deal, the local population aside. Yeah, we'll see soon enough how this bears out in practice. Trump will be president starting next week, and we'll be back in a week as well, probably talking about the early stages of the Trump administration. See you all then.
Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.